Pressures and consequences. Why do LGBTQ youth experience disproportionately negative health outcomes? Minority sexual preferences have been stigmatized through much of history. While there have been advancements in the acceptance of alternate sexualities, the acceptance is not honored by everyone. There are still incidences of young people who identify as gay, bisexual, asexual, non-binary, or any number of alternate sexualities who are disowned by family. These young people are also often subject to bullying, abuse, and ridicule in their schools and community. The CDC reports that LGBTQ youth have been found to be at a greater risk of homelessness, prostitution, substance abuse, and depressive mental health issues than their heterosexual peers. The CDC also notes that nearly 1/3, or 29%, of LGBTQ youth attempt suicide compared to 6% of heterosexual youth. Facing these issues early in life usually leads to maladaptation and a host of health issues. This presentation will look at each of these areas and detail some of the pressures that lead to these consequences, as well as some lifestyle medicine interventions that could be used to combat the multitude of negative impacts presented. A 2018 study in the Journal of Marriage and Family notes that 1 in 10 young U.S. adults, aged 18 to 25 years, experiences homelessness in a 1-year period. While LGBTQ youth make up only about 5 to 8% of the overall youth population, they account for at least 40% of the homeless youth. 73% of gay and lesbian youth reported parental disapproval of their sexual orientation as the reason for being homeless. However, the study found that many other factors come into play concerning family rejection, including socioeconomic status, family conflict, parental use of drugs or alcohol, and traumatic life events such as loss of income or a death in the family. This same study found other levels of complexity concerning rejection. Many of the youth in the study reported parents expressing their unconditional love for the child, while at the same time putting on a great deal of pressure to act straight in a heteronormative way that felt foreign to the child's identity. The irony of today's LGBTQ children growing up in a more accepting U.S. society is that it leads to more of them coming out at an earlier age and therefore living with the family strain that it often causes for a longer amount of time. This has been shown to heighten the feelings of rejection and lead to an earlier path to homelessness. This study noted that family reunification is most often the goal of solving homelessness. While supporting this goal, the authors note that other factors such as poverty and instability need to be taken into account. Poor families and families of color may not have the resources or access to services that might help all parties find acceptance of an alternative sexuality. In a Sage Journal Criminal Justice Review, the authors point out how youth involved in prostitution were long regarded as juvenile delinquents and treated as criminals. However, after the passage of the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, TVPA, in 2000, there has been an important shift in seeing and treating these youth as sex trafficking victims. A 2012 study of young prostitutes of various sexual identities found that 73% of them reported repeated abuse and neglect while growing up. However, the study also found that these youth tended to look on prostitution as a choice that they had to make to get away from their family situations, and none of them considered themselves victims. In a paper published in 2014 by the U.S. Health and Human Services Department, a number of factors were found to be a cause of minors getting involved in prostitution, among them threats, extortion, sexual assault, and pimping. The paper notes that homeless LGBTQ minors are most often targeted and are at the highest risk of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. These young people then experience high rates of depression and anxiety, substance abuse, physical violence, and exposure to communicable diseases such as tuberculosis, STIs, and HIV. Since there is often a code of silence and stigma associated with prostitution, the authors state that law enforcement agencies and community leaders must encourage the reporting of sex trafficking of LGBTQ individuals and recognize that they are victims of a crime, while at the same time, trained therapists need to understand the psychology of LGBTQ youth who often do not identify as victims. Public health policy should be focused on promoting awareness of the problem, identifying sexual exploitation, and providing paths to health resources targeted at LGBTQ youth. A 2018 national survey on drug use showed that nearly 50% of LGBTQ youth struggled with illicit drugs, just over 70% struggled with alcohol use, and 20% struggled with using both. Moving into adulthood, the study showed that LGBTQ adults are more than twice as likely as heterosexual adults, 39% versus 17%, to have used illicit drugs in a one-year period, and 16.5% of LGBTQ adults, just over 2 million people, had a substance use disorder, SUD, compared to under 8% of the total population. The National Institute on Drug Abuse reports that sexual minorities with SUDs are more likely to have comorbid psychiatric disorders, such as frequent mental distress and depression, than are heterosexuals. The National Institute on Drug Abuse states that effective treatments for LGBTQ people include motivational interviewing, social support therapy, contingency management, and cognitive behavioral therapy. Addiction treatment programs with specialized groups for gay and bisexual men have shown better outcomes, but the Institute cites one study that showed only 7.4% of U.S. programs provide such specialized services. In a 2017 study of 61 LGBTQ persons seeking asylum in the U.S., interviews with the participants revealed that the majority of them had been persecuted during childhood by family and peers and then became subjects of torture when they grew older. The study noted that LGBTQ asylum seekers were at a much higher risk of health disturbances such as PTSD, major depression, loneliness, as well as feelings of guilt, shame, and helplessness. In a 2018 study of 364 gay and bisexual men, it was reported that sexual minority men report higher psychological distress than heterosexual men, including depression and anxiety. The study found that the reasons for this included childhood emotional and sexual abuse, homophobic peer victimization, internalized homophobia, loneliness, and dysfunctional attitudes, all linked emotionally in some form to early childhood. A 2018 national survey on drug use showed that more than 26% of LGBTQ 18 to 25 years old have seriously considered suicide, more than 10% have made a plan, and 5.4% had attempted to take their lives. These numbers are all 2 to 3 times higher than the national rates. The authors of the asylum seeker study noted that since most are survivors of childhood trauma, clinicians should be familiar with the multitude of literature regarding treatment of such cases. However, since they stated that there might also be significant language and culture barriers depending on the country of origin, they recommended nonverbal therapies such as art, music, and mindfulness-based stress reduction. The authors of the psychological distress study also recommended mindfulness-based cognitive therapy as a way to reduce stress and dysfunctional attitudes among gay and bisexual men. The pressures placed on LGBTQ youth, such as family rejection, bullying, and feelings of isolation, are not unique to the community. They are, however, much more widespread and therefore have significantly higher negative health impacts. Any caregiver looking to mitigate the consequences of childhood trauma must take this into account before developing any intervention plan.